All right, thanks, Scott. It's also good to be with you here this morning. And Scott asked us to review our areas and what might have gone wrong. So did soil fertility issues have any role in reducing yields last year? And really, I don't think last year we had anything that was a lot different than years past, but there are some trends going on now I'm seeing that might explain some of the things. And luckily, we do have the tools to watch out for some of these things. As you know, peanuts are a legume. They can fix nitrogen. They got deep tap roots, so they're good scavengers of P and K. So a lot of the focus on soil fertility with peanut is on calcium. It's got to be in, you have to have calcium in the top 3 inches of the soil because it dissolves with water and goes directly into the nuts when they're developing. And the main pod fill period is between 60 and 90 days. So that comes into play with what we do on calcium. Some of the things that can go wrong with calcium, and I'm not saying a lot of this happened last year, but our recommendation is to apply gypsum, for example, at early bloom, somewhere around probably 35 days after planting. I get questions all the time, can I apply it at planting? And that can be too early. If you get enough water, especially early on, remember they don't really start feeling good till 60 days after planting, that calcium is mobile and can leach right below the pegging zone. So you can apply it too early, that is possible. You can also obviously apply it too late. I get a lot of questions. I get a lot of fertility issues. I get how late's too late. And you find out you need calcium and you're out there 80-day-old peanut, and you don't want to run over the vines, that can be an issue. Some people are cutting the rate of gypsum, and if you really need calcium, you're below that 500-pound level in the soil and you really need 1,000 pounds of gypsum and you cut to 500, you could possibly cut your yield. Now, a lot of folks are using a cut rate of gypsum just kind of as insurance. They're pretty sure they have enough. They probably have 1,000 pounds in their soil. I'm going to go out there with 500 pounds of gypsum. That's probably fine. But cutting the rate when you really need it can hurt you. And then, you have to have water dissolve that calcium to get into the nut. So even under irrigation, if you have a breakdown or don't have the capacity, it is possible that even under irrigation, you don't have enough water during certain periods and dry spells and critical periods to get that calcium into the nut. We had a few cases this year where we had some pretty severe pops, and the county agents and the farmers, they went out and took soil samples, and it looked like they had plenty of calcium in irrigated land and had a lot of pops. And there aren't a lot of other things that cause pops besides calcium in a peanut. So that's a little frustrating. The only thing I can think of is possibly they just had a critical period where they didn't have enough water to get that calcium into the nut. And then everybody, as mentioned, Hurricane Irma, but that came in pretty late. And again, at that point, calcium probably should have been in pretty good shape. So pH is another big issue. You probably heard this story before. There's a picture from Eric and I went both, and I think Bob too, went out to this field. Turned out to be low pH on the left, about 4.9, and on the right about 6.0 or so. We know that low pH can cause aluminum and zinc toxicities to the point of killing the plant. But you can also get too high. And how high is too high? I get that question a lot. I don't get real nervous till they get up above 7. You don't really need to run them that high, but I have seen a lot of them being run up in that range, and it can cause manganese deficiency. Actually, manganese deficiency probably doesn't hurt you that bad, especially if it's late in the season. Probably what I'm more concerned with these high pHs, and again, I probably see more high pHs than low pHs looking at soil samples. I'm going to skip that's availability. If you have a high pH, it's probably because you put a lot of lime out, which has calcium in it, so you also usually have high calcium, and it could cause potassium deficiency. You might have heard the terms cation exchange capacity and base saturation, and basically all that means is that the soil has a net negative charge and can hold positive ions, things like hydrogen, calcium, magnesium, potassium. And if you get your calcium levels really high, even though your potassium might look okay, it's a competition, and the soil doesn't have any way to hold that potassium, and it can leach and get away from us. So that is a possibility. Base saturation is just the percentage of each of those on those negative charges. So you can kind of look at that to get a gauge on whether you might cause a potassium issue. And I didn't see potassium deficiency in peanut for my first 18 years or so here in Georgia. But lately it's been showing up more and more. And one of the reasons I think it is that with our short rotations, growing peanut after peanut, and if we don't put fertilizer out, we're dropping our potassium levels, and this is showing up more. You add to that if you take the peanut hay off, grow peanut after peanut, take the hay off, you're also exporting a good amount of potassium. Again, we can catch this with soil sampling. So if you do happen to be doing peanut after peanut, taking the hay off, sample the soil, you should be able to pick up those drops in potassium and then put the recommended rate out if it's called for. And that's the next thing I wanted to talk about is that, normally if you're running your phosphorus and potassium levels where you should be for other crops, you should not have to put potassium or phosphorus or potassium on a peanut. It should look like this. That's a little scary, but that recommendation there only calls for half a pound of boron. And you have to get pretty low on a peanut. We actually have a separate set of numbers from UGA. This is Malic 1. For example, you notice for all other crops, you have to get down to 60 or below to be considered low on potassium. You got to get all the way down to 30 on peanuts to be considered low. But it can happen, and I think we've been trained so much to say, peanuts don't need any P and K. You can get low enough where you need them. This is just an example, and this is not from a farmer's field. This is actually from a research situation here in Tifton, where the researcher was growing peanut after peanut for at least 3 years. Said he even put out some 5, 10, 15, so he should have been putting some potassium back, but notice that the potassium there is down to 20 pounds per acre on the soil test level, and it's calling for 80 pounds of potash. And maybe he hasn't been putting out enough or whatever, so he's going to try that this year. So that can happen. When you do that, you have a good chance of response. Just a couple other things to wrap up. Boron, I think we're doing a decent job with boron. Our recommendation is half a pound of boron per acre. If you're using soluble, it's 2.5 pounds. If you're using a 10% liquid, it's 2 quarts to get that half a pound of boron. Boron would cause an internal damage called hollow heart. You wouldn't necessarily pick it up in yields. We do have some inoculation problems which lead to nitrogen deficiency, but again, we don't see that many of them around. I think we're doing a good job with inoculation, and we're in shorter rotations. So basically, if you follow this strategy that we've been preaching for years, basically soil tests, lime to pH 6 to 6.5, build your P and K or fertilizer if they're low, inoculate, provide calcium in the pegging zone, boron, and troubleshoot, you should be in pretty good shape to be able to handle almost any weather situations.